Folks, hello. Um, I hope you're doing well, as always. Um, been a little while since I've sent something out that kind of was general, tried to kind of touch base with everybody, but it seems like it's probably time to do so. It is, what is today? Today is Thursday, the 19th of August. So we are wrapping up week nine. Going into next week will already be week 10, right? Told you week one, or whenever it was, like this flies. It never ceases to amaze me how quickly this goes. But yeah, we are going into week 10, which, basically means that's typically with courses, right? That's the last, like, functional week. And then moving into week 11 is typically finals week, but thankfully, for better or worse, we don't have to worry about a final with the course. We just have small things like research papers and presentations and just, the easy stuff. So, thought it would be worthwhile to, like I say, kind of reach out to everybody, do the sort of let's try to take stock of kind of where things are at and the overall picture of things, even though, kind of within our class, folks are just about every conceivable location along the spectrum in terms of nearing completion or still in some phases where a lot needs to be done and everything in between. And so there's no hard and fast way to sort of capture where things are at because of all that variability, but to at least try to kind of at least make reference to the way the course is laid out, the modules and the syllabus, and all that bit. So at this stage, sort of at least according to like the kind of rubric, series of mileposts, that sort of a thing, we should be at the stage where we are putting the final pieces of the paper basically together. We have our introduction, we have the methods and all the description of all those things. We've gathered our data, we've run our analyses and got the results. And so we are really kind of putting it all together. A lot, I know, as I keep saying in a lot of these, like for many of you, I'm meeting with you like sometimes multiple times a week, working very closely. Others, not at all, which again is fine. But I know that for at least most of the people that I've been working with most closely, it seems like most folks are kind of at that stage where they're working on the discussion, they're trying to kind of touch up the other parts of the paper, kind of bring, revisiting the introduction and in light of having done the research now, completing the paper, kind of going back, doing the refinement and the, you know, crossing the T's, dotting the I's, all that sort of a thing. Um, Getting the materials and the methods and everything like that. It's one thing when you lay it out initially. This is one of the things, of course, about research that I think is one of the most fundamental, which is your sort of plan, and the picture that you have in your head is a very different creature than from actual boots on the ground when you are trying to implement it. You're actually running into all of the troubleshooting and the issues along the way and the reality of how those things play out. And so hopefully all of those things, I know, are stressful, but provide a lot of, firsthand experience of what that is. I mean, quite honestly, real research, I feel like, is like 92% just troubleshooting. It's a very small percent of actually designing the damn thing, at least initially, and then doing your analysis and those kinds of things. So, for better or worse, I know that that's been the case for a lot of folks. We've done a lot of troubleshooting over these weeks, but that should be giving you fodder. And just for what it's worth, to kind of put it out there, those of you who we've been talking and working together, you already know this, but kind of for everybody, um, arguably, at least to my way of thinking, the discussion section should be probably the easiest part of your paper to write. Um, in a very generalized kind of way, the way I typically would present it, at least to like students in 301, that sort of thing, is that if your data came back in support of your hypothesis, you got a significant outcome, it was commensurate and consistent with the hypothesis or hypotheses that you had put forward, then your discussion should be reasonably straightforward. Let me take a couple steps back here and then I'll catch back up to where I was just at. Your results section, you've taken the data, you've organized them, laid them out, we've done the analysis, we know what the outcome now is with those data. that results section in and of itself should be very brief. Which is to say, the results is not where we get into, for instance, interpreting what the data were or are. We don't even really speak to whether or not what they look like in light of our hypothesis. That's where we start the discussion section. So your results should be very straightforward in terms of, a one-way analysis of variance was conducted on the mean number of a quick explanation of these were the variables, this is what we measured, this is the analysis we used, here is, APA format, the F test or the T test or whatever analysis was appropriate for your study. And that's really about it. We don't get chit-chatty about what those results look like till we shift down into the discussion section. And that's where we say, okay, and in light of everything I told you up above in my introduction in relation to all this literature and the rationale for the study, the hypotheses that were generated from that, here's what the data tell us about that. They supported or failed to support those hypotheses. So back to where I promised I'd come back to. If you did obtain significant results, if your results were consistent with the hypothesis, great. Your discussion section then should be a little bit about these were the data, they did support the hypothesis. Here's a bit about why that seemed to be the case, which I already should have kind of made that argument right in my introduction as the justification. And what does it mean now? Because you gave us a snapshot too. You gave me or the reader or whomever was going through that paper a snapshot of the literature and some about the body of research that exists in that particular arena. So now that you have your results, what does it mean in that bigger picture? How does it relate to support or dispute, things that you described in your introduction? Give us some context, right? Plug it into the bigger picture and let us know something about how you, the researcher, perceive that study to kind of fit into that scheme. If, on the other hand, you failed to obtain significant results, either they simply failed to reach the threshold of significance, or, in a great number of cases I know, they just didn't fit at all. There can be so many potential reasons for this, right? And so in your discussion section, you're going to start off by saying the analysis failed to capture a significant result, or I'm not feeling particularly articulate right now. We failed to observe a significant outcome. The data failed to support the hypothesis, and that's perfectly fine. And now your discussion section, instead of, saying, great, this is wonderful, it's what I predicted, here's what it all means, you're probably going to spend a little bit more time trying to speak to, well, why is that the case? And this is a lot less, it's a lot less sort of structured in the sense that you're very free here to take that discussion in the directions that you feel are the most appropriate. You're the researcher. You're the person who designed this thing. You're the person who implemented it. You're the one who saw how your sampling process went. You're the one who started to realize, maybe this measurement tool wasn't the most accurate, or here's a confound I didn't really contemplate until I started letting the data roll in, and that became apparent to me over time. The definition, the operational definition of variables. There are a host of reasons why we would not obtain a significant outcome or obtain an outcome that's consistent with the hypothesis. And you just speak to that. Think about it as not only are you sort of running it through in your own mind, sort of trying to understand better why the study ended up the way that it did, but you're also writing it in a way, think of it as writing it to yourself. If you were going to do the study again, what were the pitfalls? What may have not gone as well as you thought? What would you do differently? And you're not just writing that for yourself, you're writing that for anybody else who reads this research paper, has a similar question in mind or a similar method in mind, and they're going to glean, right, an incredible amount of insight, because instead of having to run a whole pilot potentially on their own, they can look to what you've done, your explanations, and understand something about everything you learned through that process. So that's where I say that the discussion really ought to feel a lot more intuitive, a lot more comfortable. It's really you're much more welcome to speak, for instance, sort of anecdotally, right, about your experience of what that was like, instead of being very rigorous, like in the introduction, where you're talking, you're referring to other people's research, you're trying to keep a high fidelity between your paraphrasing of what they did and found and that sort of a thing. It's a lot more structured. The discussion is structured, but you can bring a lot more of your own experience, perception, thought, observation, all of that to bear on it. And then, of course, way back when, right, I talked about sort of the hourglass thing. You're starting that discussion narrow. Here were the outcomes, the results. Here's what they mean directly in relation to my hypotheses. Here's a bit about my study and how that all played out in my study. Here's how it relates to the bigger picture. And great, we're good. So I don't know if that's helpful or not. Of course, that's very generic. When I'm working with you guys one-on-one, it's much easier to kind of speak to your exact experiment or study or experiences, those sorts of things. So as always, I'm around if you want to do any more of that. Okay, a few other things. I don't want to make this long, but I want to make sure I cover some things so that hopefully this will, again, like address some of the questions you maybe are encountering, clarify some of the things, because, we are coming up towards the end here. Things are getting pretty real pretty quick. With your papers, as you're working on the papers, one of the things, if you've gone ahead, you've kind of been looking through the modules, you may have seen that there was, I forget now, I'm sure it was in the final paper module, but there was one that was called a final paper checklist, or the checklist for the final paper, something like that. If you saw that already, don't worry too much about what was on that. I've actually gone in and I unpublished that page because I found the criteria that were laid out are not appropriate right now, really, for the kinds of papers, the kind of projects that we're doing. For instance, just off the top of my head, I feel like one of the criteria said, like, your methods section should be like between 3 and 5 pages. Probably not. The vast majority of the projects during this term for this project were correlational. We were utilizing different questionnaires or surveys or putting together things like that. Methodologically, there's not a lot to that, right? It's one thing if you're describing an experiment and here's how I controlled these variables, here's how I defined these variables, here's how I made the manipulation, here's how I, tried to keep subject. There's a lot of explanation that can go into a methods, but there's no way in hell you're going to fill 5 pages describing how you posted a survey online. So I just cut out that checklist because that was just one example. None of it felt like it mapped quite appropriately. And this is where, it's good news, bad news, right? Depending on the kind of student you are. The good news, bad news is that I'm not particularly keen on like page criteria. Almost without exception, when you have a course in which papers are written, the question is, how many pages does it need to be? How many pages do you want? How many pages, and so I can get this grade? And for better or worse, to my mind, page number has nothing to do with it. As a research paper, you're going to have a lot of pages, period, right? You have a page for your title page. You have a page for the abstract. Your introduction definitely should span at least a couple up to several pages to try and capture, right, all those things that you were doing in the literature review and some of the background. And then once you get to that methods section, again, it's going to vary a lot. Some of you did experimental designs, most of you did not. Your methods basically should just reflect how much do I need to know, right? Methodologically, what do you need to tell me about your sampling and who your participants were? What do you need to tell me about the tools that you used, right? If you are doing an experiment and you manipulated, some of you did like images on the computer and things like that. Yes, I want definitely a very clear description of what those things were. If you used a survey or a questionnaire, explain what it was. You should have made reference to it at some place in the introduction so that your reader, myself, whomever, already is familiar with where this thing came from and sort of the rationale for why you were utilizing it. So by the time you get to that materials section, basically you're going to say, yeah, remember that thing up there? Yeah, that's what I used. And here's the citation. And if you straight up used it, then that's sufficient. For some of you, like we made modifications or made slight adaptations onto that thing that pre-existed. This is where you would describe that. We used the flibbity flabbity hibbity habbity questionnaire by Joe Blah Bong people et al. But, to more accurately reflect the question I was asking, we made slight modifications to a handful of the questions to more closely resemble X, Y, and Z. Should be reasonably straightforward. And then again, methods. What I often ask people to do when they're writing their method section is to get somebody else to look at it, to read through it. It's all too easy, and I don't claim an exemption from this by any stretch. I know what my methods were. I know what I did. I know how it all went down. And then I'm the one who types it out, writes it out, chooses the language and the description and everything else. And then I'm the one that goes back and reads it. And as I'm reading it, I'm like, yeah, this makes a hell of a lot of sense to me. That's exactly what I did. But of course, it's coming from a place in which I'm already completely equipped with all of that information. A lay person who's unfamiliar with my study may read that and have a hell of a lot of questions. Well, what do you mean exactly by this? Well, when did you do this? Well, how did you get X, Y, or Z, right? It's a fresh set of eyes can really point out those blind spots that we have, right? Because we just automatically fill them in because we know what those things were. We don't have to make assumptions. And so I try to emphasize to people as you write, particularly like a method section, this should be something that you could take. Never have a conversation with the person. Just hand it off to a person and say, I'm going on vacation. I need you to run my study. They should be able to take that description and say, okay, yeah, I can do this. This is the instructions on how to execute your study. Sounds easy. I make it sound easy. It's not that damn easy. Which actually, this is going to bring me on to another thing here in a second, which is the peer review piece. So put a bookmark there for a second. I'm going to come back to that peer review aspect in a moment. To just try and capture what I was trying to say about that overall with the paper then is some of you will be able to write an extraordinary, clear, amazing, terrific research paper and do it in maybe 10 pages or less. Others are not going to be able to crush it down into something that's succinct. It's going to take more space to get an adequate description, to get your thoughts all out onto paper. And so for my way of thinking, page number, it's a disservice to anybody who's writing a paper like this to say a page number has any relation to how good or bad the paper is going to be. If you can write a full, complete, but very succinct paper in a short chunk, that is terrific. And in fact, that's when, if you're going on to graduate school, if you're going to do anything in research down the road, it's a wonderful skill to have, because when you actually send this stuff off for publication, they don't want 47 pages of fluff. Get to the point as quickly and as succinctly as you sort of can. There's an art to that. But there's nothing wrong with having longer papers either. If it takes more space to say what you need to say, that's fine. So I'm not going to look at your page numbers and make any decisions about points or lack of points or anything like that. It's, can you write a good paper? Are you presenting the information that ought to be presented? Is it being presented clearly? Is it being formatted in the appropriate ways to be consistent with APA and some of those sorts of things? I hope that helps, but like I say, it's good news, bad news. For a lot of people, it's bad news because it's like, what the hell do you mean? I need to know how many pages to do this, to do this, to do this, to have a very structured sense of how it works. And all I can say is, sorry about that. Let me know though. If it's not clear, if you are stressed about it, if you need to know things more specific to that, I'm here. Let me know. That's I can help with that. Okay. Now I bounce back to this peer review piece. So you're maybe seeing, depending on where you're at and what you're looking through and reading and the like. So we're sort of set to do reviews of each other's, right? Exchanging papers. If I'm not mistaken, I think the language in the module suggests that I was going to like create groups and do this sort of a thing. And quite honestly, that's more that comes more from a place of when this course would be an usual term. It would be a bigger course. There'd be more people to kind of put into groups and the like. Um, Number one, we aren't a big, huge class. We're a reasonably small group. And number two, and much more significantly, as I said, like right out of the gates with this message, people are all over the map in terms of where you're at currently with this project. So the idea of kind of throwing everybody together as though we have all these papers that are at about the same location and we can kind of swap and chit chat and help each other out. Unfortunately, that's just not viable at this point in time. And so all this wonderful stuff I just said a few minutes ago about make sure you put another set of eyes on it. It's invaluable how much another, nervous system trying to process this stuff can be in clarifying our blind spots or places where our language is murky, mucky, whatever. Um, this isn't to say I want to throw out the peer review thing altogether, but if you sort of scrolled on just beyond that point, you maybe saw that I had put a little blurb in that module that said, hey, instead of doing this grouping thing and the peer review the way that it's sort of written out in the syllabus and whatever else, given the nature of this course, given the nature of the variance of where folks are with their projects, I still want you to have that opportunity. And so what I proposed on there was, instead of plug this into Canvas and get grouped and that sort of a thing, instead get to a point, if you're at that place now where you basically have your paper together, you have the components. It's not perfect. This isn't something you're ready to fully submit, but it's reasonably there. Message me. Shoot the paper to me. Say, hey, I'm at that place. I'd love to have feedback from somebody else so that I can kind of polish this thing up and tie a bow on it and all that. And I'm also ready to look at someone else's paper and try to provide that kind of feedback for them. In doing it this way, I mean, it's not perfect, as though anything about this course has been perfect. It's not perfect, but if you are one of those people that's like today ready for that, send it to me. Somebody else will likely be at that place here today ready as well. They'll send it. I can get you two paired off. Send your paper, get you working on that with one another so that you can get to those next steps. For those who are further behind, it's not going to be until the weekend, after the weekend, into next week, different times. When you arrive at that place, send me that paper. Then somebody else who is also somewhat contemporaneous with that, I can take you, send that paper, you guys can go. And so it's kind of the best case scenario, at least it's the best that I can come up with in terms of still having a viable way in which we can do the peer review. Not only is it helpful to get that feedback directly for your own paper, but it is a really terrific exercise also to go through somebody else's, to see the way that they've approached it, the way that they've written it, be thinking about it, right, critically, and evaluating it and providing that feedback. There's an extraordinary amount of sort of learning and just development that happens through that exercise as well. And I absolutely want us to be able to do this. So that's the option that I've come up with. If you have thoughts, if there's any other way, like I'm way open to anything that's out there, but that's the plan unless we come up with something else at this point. Okay, I said I'm going to try to keep this short. I only have one more thing. I don't even know how long I've been talking. I can't see. That's probably for the best. Okay, presentations. So hopefully you can sort of see, if you've gotten into and read a bit about the presentation component, putting together a PowerPoint that will sort of capture, summarize, and present your research project. First things first. So there are a handful of a couple of examples of what those presentations have looked like, good versions of what would constitute a really great presentation. Somewhere in there, I know there was language that alluded to the fact that it was located somewhere earlier or prior in the term, which kind of sent, I think, a few people looking back through modules of previous weeks and not finding it. That was a mistake. I apologize for that. But those examples are there. The original location, you'll still find them there. The very last full module is the one labeled Final Paper, and the very last node within that module is the one that contains the example presentations. I duplicated it and I pulled that same thing up into the week 10 module. So if you're going through week 10 and you're finding some of the, content about the presentations, there should also be that node in there that contains the example presentations. If you're not familiar, check those out. And what you're going to see is basically what it is just a condensed recapitulation of your paper. So you're going to run through it in exactly the same format that your research paper does. Here's an introduction to sort of the global overarching topic that you were interested in and that you were going to do a study on. Here's basically what was your introduction. Here's a little background. Here's what folks have done. Here's what they've found. Here's how they've designed things. Here's the methods and, the relevant sort of background. Condensed though, right? These are not PowerPoint slides where you cut and paste paragraphs and place them there. The presentation is meant to be kind of bulleted. Here's a boom, here's a quick, this has been demonstrated. This has been done. Here are some methods that were used, right? Plugging in the relevant pieces, but, summarizing them, condensing them down. Run through some of the background, and then here's my hypothesis into the methods section. Here's who I sampled and how I sampled them. Here are the materials, right? Each one of these is basically like a slide. Participants, materials, methods, results. A handful to kind of go through the discussion, which is exactly what I was just describing a little while ago. Just again, sort of condensed down to basic bullet points that kind of capture the overarching idea that you're communicating. And then handful of references. That's all there is to it. So it sounds like a lot, right? Presentation, like that word sends chills down most people's spines and panic through their cortex. But realistically, it should be very straightforward. Take a look at those examples. It's about 10 to 15, 12 to 15 slides. But again, think of it in relation to your paper. Here's a sort of title slide. Here's a few introduction slides, participants, materials. It takes no time at all before you have 10 to 15 slides just out of basic necessity. And there's no reason that these have to be big, flowery, amazing. This is take the fundamental piece, plug it in, bullet point, fundamental, plug it, plug it, plug it. That should be all there is to it. As always, like if you look through them, if you still have more questions, if you want to go through them and work on them together, that's what I'm here for. So let me know. And I think that's all I wanted to talk about. I'm sure I'm neglecting a number of things that are on your minds in addition to this. So let me know, obviously, what those are, and I will continue to be working with each person as you need it. I've been hearing a lot more from everybody, kind of as is usually the case, as people started getting more towards particularly the statistical analysis piece, but then also just putting it all together, right? The research paper can feel very overwhelming. I'm very aware of that. My goal is to mitigate that as much as I possibly can. So for those of you with whom I'm working, that's a sentence, with whom I'm working closely and meeting and doing all that, great, let's keep doing it, all of that. I don't swear. I'm sure I'll say it again. This might be the last time, but probably not. But for those of you who haven't been, you just remember, open invitation. I'm here. Don't stress. Don't sit and wonder if this is right or if you should have or if I ought to or whatever. Let me know. For what it's worth, like I said, today is Thursday. Just an FYI, I'll have my computer and stuff but I have family in town. I will be leaving town tomorrow. So I won't be quite as on top of jumping on messages or jumping on meetings and things like that, at least Friday, Saturday, maybe Sunday. But I'll absolutely have my phone, probably take my computer, and especially if you need something, don't not right, still contact me. I will absolutely still be on top of it. And particularly if you're really needing something, don't hesitate to let me know that. We can absolutely get it figured out during that time. It's not a problem. So, okay, that was a lot just your way. I'm going to shut up now and let you go. I hope this is helpful. I hope you're doing well. I hope this all isn't overwhelming you too much. But hey, silver lining, right? I'm such a bright side kind of guy. It's not true. We're just about there. We're going into week 10, then we're going into the finals week. We're at this point now where we're so close to the end we can taste it, but we also have sufficient time that if you're stressing out, we still have time. And it's just a matter of getting focused on what those things are, addressing them, and making it happen. So, with that, I'll let you go. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and I'm extremely excited. This is the most fun part for me because I get to see all these final projects roll in now, and the presentations and the papers and the culmination of all of the work you put in, which is not insignificant, as you well know. So, be well, talk soon, and cheers.